Hi, in this video I want to talk a little about what I'm calling Holiness Code theology, or maybe the priestly strand of the Pentateuch, theology especially in the priestly parts of the Pentateuch. So what is this priestly layer of the Pentateuch? Well, you can think of it as more than one way. In more than one way, you might simply think of it as those parts of the Pentateuch that relate to holiness, that relate to the tabernacle, that relate to the priests. There is a substantial portion of the Pentateuch that relates to this sort of thing. In fact, more than half of the Pentateuch has to do with these sorts of concerns that would have been of concern to a priest of Israel. This might include genealogies and so forth. Now, of course, there is one school of biblical criticism that thinks that this was a distinct editing phase of the Pentateuch, as it were, that perhaps the narratives of the Pentateuch before Deuteronomy was attached, as it were, that there was a priestly hand that synthesized the narratives together with this material. You don't have to form a conclusion on that. It changes a little from time to time. But there is a current agreement that the holiness layer of the Pentateuch is old. It's sometimes called H for holiness, especially Leviticus 17 through 26. And then of Exodus 25 through 40, and all of Leviticus has a priestly concern to it. All the stuff about the tabernacle, about the vestments and garments for the priests, what the priests are supposed to do, what kinds of sacrifices are supposed to be offered, how they're supposed to be offered. All of that is generally considered priestly through Numbers 10, basically. Possibly the genealogies, the records, the lineages are sometimes considered material that would relate to this concern in the Pentateuch. And then some think that the redactor of Genesis through Numbers may have been a priestly school, as it were, that added Genesis 1 as a kind of introduction. Now, you don't have to accept any of that. It is helpful in terms of categorizing material in the Pentateuch. It is helpful to recognize that about half of the material in the Pentateuch has to do with purity and with the priestly functions of the tabernacle and the priests and the genealogies and so forth. So this is a layer of the Pentateuch, whether you think it is a distinct phase of its development or whether you think it's just one genre within the Pentateuch. Either way, we can kind of look at it and ask what are the distinct theology perspectives of this layer of the Pentateuch. So, for example, what is the view of God that we would see in Genesis 1, the latter chapters of Exodus, in Leviticus, in the first 10 chapters of Numbers? What is the view of God, particularly, that we find in this layer of the Pentateuch? Well, of course, if Genesis 1 is part of this layer, we see that God is the creator. And of course, there's no mention of other gods in Genesis 1. This is one of the things that makes Genesis 1 distinctive from other ancient Near Eastern creation stories like the Enuma Elish. And the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, there is this great conflict that is part of the creation of the world. And of course, the creation of the world in the Enuma Elish is not out of nothing, but out of chaotic waters, as it were. Creation is creating order out of chaos. Of course, Genesis 1 can be viewed in that way as well. But the key thing is that there are no other gods in conflict with God in the creation of the world. Elohim creates the world. Elohim is the generic word for God that's used in Genesis 1. Elohim creates the order of the cosmos without any conflict or help in Genesis 1. I think that would have been striking in the days of ancient Israel. So God is creator in this strand of the Pentateuch. Yahweh is, of course, a source of blessing in this strand of the Pentateuch. We mentioned in a previous video about Deuteronomistic theology, about the kind of covenant relationship between God and Israel. So we have hints in this layer, this priestly layer of the Pentateuch, that again there is God is the patron, as it were, of Israel. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you. The Lord be gracious to you. The Lord lift his countenance upon you and give you peace. Again, this sense that Yahweh has a special relationship with Israel is implicit even in this layer of the Pentateuch. So what else do we infer about God? I think a key aspect of God that we can infer from this layer of the Pentateuch especially is that God is a God of order. I think that's one of the key takeaways about God that we want to infer from Genesis 1 and from Leviticus and from this particular strand of the Pentateuch. So notice in Genesis 1 that God creates the world according to kinds. There's a clear taxonomy. God is a J in personality type in this priestly strand of the Pentateuch. God divides up the world is divided, as it were, according to kinds in this layer. And more on that in a second. God is obviously a God of holiness in this layer of the Pentateuch. What belongs to God is set apart from ordinary things. What belongs to God has to be treated with care because God is holy. To say that God is holy is to say that God is God, is to say that we need to watch out because God is God. And of course, at Mount Sinai, which is not necessarily part of this priestly strand, but at Mount Sinai, if even an animal touched Mount Sinai while God was there, the animal was to be stoned and put to death. So there is this sense that God is a holy God. Be holy as I am holy is part of this layer of the Pentateuch. God is a God of sacrifice. So the primary means by which Israel relates to God in this strand of the Pentateuch is through sacrifice. The priestly operations, the priestly structures, these are the focal mechanisms and mediations of interaction with God in this part of the Pentateuch. Again, over half of the Pentateuch is not given to sacrifices per se, but to these sorts of concerns about how to order the world appropriately to relate to God. Okay, so a little bit about God. What about the creation? Well, again, like I said, this strand of it's fairly clear to me that the worldview of this strand of the Pentateuch is very much sees the world as a collection of kinds. There are clear boundaries between the kinds of things in the universe. There are clear boundaries, for example, between what is clean and what is unclean. We don't quite, in modern culture, Western culture especially, we don't really get clean and unclean. It's not really part of our repertoire of things. And so, maybe we know what the cooties are. You can get the cooties, or there's the 5-second rule. If something's on the floor, more than 5 seconds, it becomes unclean. If you pick it up right away, it's not. Scientifically, that's not true. These are just vestiges of clean and unclean. You wouldn't drink out of a toilet bowl, even if you knew the water was, even if your head knew that the water in the toilet bowl was perfectly clean, just as clean as from the faucet. You still wouldn't drink it because it's unclean, even though it's not. And so we have some vestiges of clean and unclean, where there's no actual scientific reality to the uncleanness. It is a putative uncleanness. It's a perception of uncleanness. It's because one person, a famous anthropologist, once said that dirt is matter out of place. So dirt is not dirty when it's in your yard, but dirt is dirty if it's in your front, on your carpet. And so this is part of the paradigm and the worldview of ancient Israel, that there were lines, invisible lines drawn around the world, making some things clean and some things not clean. And this is part and parcel. This is ground zero of the worldview of the priestly strand of the Pentateuch. So, for example, the food laws, I appreciate those who say that the food laws were about good hygiene, or were about, not getting sick or trichinosis in pork. These strike me as modern attempts to make sense of something that really has everything to do with the worldview of the ancient Near East, and that this is us trying to demythologize, as it were, the text, or rather deculturize the text, try to find some universal scientific explanation. But I personally find it much more convincing that the food laws have to do with the different kinds of things in the world. So clean birds should fly. And I'm getting this from, who am I getting this from? The name escapes me. Maybe it'll jump out to me. I didn't come up with this. But that, if a bird can't fly, that's not what a bird is supposed to be. And so an ostrich is unclean. It's not the right kind of bird. Same thing. Clean fish should have fins and scales. Eels that just don't belong. They're out of sorts. They're disorderly. They don't fit the cosmos. And so don't eat eel. It doesn't fit. Clean animals should not creep. Things that are on the earth should walk that you eat. And so creeping things, unclean. So you can see there's a certain kind of logic. Mary Douglas is the one who said dirt is matter out of place, anthropologist, and wrote on the Holiness codes. Purity and Danger was her famous work. So there is a kind of implicit theology to the food laws even here that has to do with this, what I call kind theology. Some things belong in certain places and other things don't. So life is in the blood. Blood actually represents life, not death. And life belongs in. If life is out, it makes you unclean. But it also has a kind of purifying. It both makes you unclean, but if it's done in the context of a sacrifice, it makes you clean. These are things that don't really fit in our worldview. They're very ancient in their connotations, but they have to do with the worldview of this priestly strand. So also foods line up with peoples, line up with gods. You might remember me saying in my video on the Theology of Deuteronomy that when two peoples went to war, it wasn't just the two peoples going to war, but their gods were going to war too. And so you can do a matching between peoples and gods, and you can do a matching between peoples and foods. And so it seems to make sense to me, on the basis of all this background, that the reason why Israelites didn't eat pig was not because of health concerns or hygienic concerns. That again strikes me as a conspicuously modern way, although it is an ancient explanation. It strikes me as a conspicuously modern way to try to explain something. But rather, the Philistines were the ones who ate pigs, and they worshipped other gods. It's a package deal. You don't worship their gods, and you don't eat their pigs. There's a curious statement near the end of Genesis that says that the Israelites, when they went to Egypt, had to live somewhere separate from the Egyptians because the Egyptians find shepherds detestable. So to Egyptians, sheep were the unclean food, as it were. And so I think we try to make the Bible fit within our worldview, and this is just a different. The Bible was incarnated revelation. It was written first for the people to whom it was written. And so we shouldn't be surprised that God speaks their language and that God reveals himself in their categories. And we should also not be surprised that the New Testament no longer considers any of these food laws binding upon us as Christians, because they had everything to do with God speaking to Israel within its ancient context. Well, so this is I call it kind of theology. We also find it in the sexual ethics. So, for example, I think maybe I can't speak to it. There are two verses that prohibit male-male sex in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, and the logic seems to be related, that male and male, don't fit together, and so this is unclean activity. It fits with not mixing mixed threads together, or not mixing seed together, or not mixing different breeds of animals together. Of course, the difference between these other things is that the New Testament retains and perhaps transforms the basis for this sexual ethic. As far as I can tell, there is no sexual ethic from the Old Testament that the New Testament does not retain. And so no matter what the inner logic of the sexual ethic might have been in the Old Testament, the New Testament as it were, presents sexual ethics within a Christian context. Other aspects of sexual ethics have to do with shaming close male relatives. So Leviticus 18, everything you didn't want to know about how not to have sex. Do not uncover the nakedness of your uncle by lying with his wife. Do not uncover the nakedness of your father by lying with his wife. This is shame language here, but there's also a sense of violating your faithfulness to your family. Of course, it's very male-oriented. It's not an egalitarian sexual ethic in Leviticus 18. Adultery, even in this part of the Old Testament, adultery is the shaming of a man by lying with his wife. You don't, at least as I understand it, within the Old Testament paradigm, you do not yet commit adultery against a woman. You commit adultery against the man that she's married to. Again, the New Testament expands these ethics, I think, in some respects. Okay, Israel is clean. I do think that in Leviticus 19, which is where we find love your neighbors yourself, that it's fairly clear in the context that Leviticus is thinking of other Israelites. But of course, again, Jesus expands this to include not only my neighbor, but my enemy, and to include the Samaritan, the person I don't want to love. But hopefully you're getting a sense, though, of the kind of theology of this layer of the Pentateuch. Okay, so what does the New Testament have to say about these purity laws? Well, the New Testament is very clear that these foods are all foods are now clean. That you can eat pork now if you want to as a Gentile. Again, I think sometimes Christians want to find some deep fulfillment to say that it's not that these parts of the Old Testament are canceled, it's just that they're fulfilled in some other way or in some broader principle. But that sort of impulse is brought on by our theology. Paul has none of that. Paul has no sense that he needs to find some fulfilled meaning for the food laws, as far as I can tell. He simply says that rule's now, it doesn't apply to Gentiles. He doesn't say it's fulfilled in some way in communion. I mean, he doesn't come up with some, I have to find a way that this is fulfilled. He simply says that no food is unclean in of itself. So, this may not be tidy, but this is, I think, good inductive Bible study. Feel free to disagree. Jew-specific boundary legislation is set aside for Gentiles. What we call the ceremonial law. Of course, that's not a biblical term. That's a later way of processing it. But we can call it the ceremonial law if you want. And so Paul basically says Gentiles don't have to be circumcised. It just doesn't apply to Gentiles. It's a Jew-specific kind of legislation. And so there are all kinds of Ephesians goes so far as to say that the law has been canceled. Now, that's not the way the whole New Testament puts it. Certainly, Jesus doesn't put it that way in Matthew 5. I've not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. And Paul himself doesn't put it that way in Romans 3:31, where he says, "Do we make void law through faith? No, we establish law." But in the presentation of Ephesians, the law was a wall between Jew and Gentile, which has been torn down by Christ. So again, in biblical theology, we get different angles on the same thing that don't necessarily contradict, but what they do is they give us a distinct perspective on the same topic. The sexual ethics, as I said, are retained. So it might not have been clear to a Jew why the food laws are out and the sexual ethics are in. That seems clear to us because in our worldview, well, obviously sexual ethics are moral and the others are just ceremonial. But that's a later distinction. That's not a distinction an ancient Jew would have understood. But when we filter how the Old Testament laws come forward as Christians, we do know from the New Testament that the ceremonial laws are not retained, but the sexual ethics are retained. Love of neighbor, as I said, is universalized. So now it's no longer just love your neighbor in Israel. Now it's love your neighbor everywhere, even if it's your enemy. Atonement. What is sin in this layer of the Pentateuch? Well, in my opinion, sin is not highly intentional in this layer of the Old Testament. Now, in the New Testament, it is. In the New Testament, sin has a heavy sense of intention and motivation. But in this layer of the Pentateuch, sin, there's not a strong distinction, in my opinion, in this layer of the Pentateuch between uncleanness and what we would call sin. And nor is intention the primary basis for sin in this section of the Pentateuch. Sin is to violate. It's more as now. I think groups today that think of sin as just anything short of perfection, or as just breaking rules, missing the mark. I think those definitions are much more appropriate for the Old Testament than the New Testament. In the New Testament, as we'll see, sin has a high connection to intentionality. What was your intention when you did that act? But in this part of the Old Testament, sin has a highly automatic connotation to it. You break the rule, whether you intended to or not. You're unclean. You must be cleansed. So that would be my contention for sin in this layer of the Old Testament. And of course, sacrifice is the means of atonement. Not just individual, but corporate. And that's an important distinction too. We tend to focus on individual sin because we're modern Western individualists. But the corporate dimension of defilement and of impurity was probably even more important in this layer of the Old Testament than individual guilt or individual sin. Okay, so let me end by summarizing what the Christian appropriation of the law seems to be. So we would believe as Christians that Christ fulfills all the sacrificial and all the atoning functions of the law. So the sacrificial law, we no longer need to do sacrifices. There's no place for a temple in Christianity because, in fact, Revelation says there will be no temple in the eternal Jerusalem. There's no need for a priesthood because Jesus is our only priest. There's no need for sacrifices for atonement because Christ has atoned for our sins. We can give sacrifices of praise, but they're not for atoning reasons. Secondly, Gentiles are not obligated to keep the purity laws. All foods are clean. Boundary laws like circumcision are not binding, and God is no longer exclusive in his relationship with Israel. Now, there are some core laws that are retained that we might call universal law, law of love, sexual ethics. These are retained in the New Testament. And then civil law, by the way, which is legislation having to do with the day-to-day activities of Israel, is not part of this layer in the way it's usually conceived. So that'll come in our next lecture, which will be the theology of the narratives of the Pentateuch.